So with that, I'm going to introduce Athletic Director of the University of California, San Diego, Earl Edwards.
Thank you very much, Cindy. And I can't tell you how excited I am to talk to this group in particular, because I've been talking to a number of groups locally, regionally, nationally about racism in our society. But this is the first group that I'll clearly say that I feel like I'm speaking to a bunch of friends because of all the people that I know and all the great things that you do as a Rotary Club. So I'm excited to talk to you about racism. But before I do that, you know, I'm obligated in my role to do a little propaganda. You mentioned it a little bit, but we did move to Division I in July. We're a member of the Big West Conference, which consists of 5 state schools and 5 UCs and the University of Hawaii. I'm pleased to say out of that conference, we're the only one that has a production studio for ESPN Plus. So we'll be able to produce 150 or so athletic events when we start having those. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to watch us compete. I also want to share with you, because it's appropriate, we all know that UC San Diego, and from a branding perspective, that's how we refer to UCSD now. It's UC San Diego. So we get away from the alphabet soup. But we've been doing a tremendous, tremendous job when it comes to COVID-19. We've got a lot of protocols on our campus, but we've essentially created a bubble, and the positive tests for our campus is somewhere between 1 and 2%. And so that's a story in itself, particularly looking at the climate that we're dealing with. So I just wanted to share that with you before I jump in to my brief discussion on racism, and just tell you my story in terms of what I'm doing and how I got here. And I think you would agree, or at least I hope that all of you agree, that now probably more than ever, we really need to be talking about racism in our society. And I say that because of the spike in white supremacy groups in our country now, which has increased by 50%. I say that because of the atrocities that we've all witnessed, starting with George Floyd. And I'm going to walk you through how I got to where I am and what I'm doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing. So for me, George Floyd was the spark. You know, as I watched George being murdered with the policeman with his knee on his neck, his hands in his pocket, other policemen standing around not doing anything, George calling out for his mother before he passed. That was the moment where I said, Earl, as a Black man in America, I can no longer be silent and not talk about race, which is something that we don't like to talk about. But having said that, just think about any problem or major issue that you know you had to address or should address, and you didn't talk about it. We all know what happens when you don't talk about a problem or a situation that, like racism, that it never changes. So after watching him being murdered, I said, I'm going to speak up. Whatever the consequences are, so be it. That's often one of the reasons why Blacks don't talk about racism. Consequences, whether it's losing your job, not being accepted in your community. There's a lot of consequences when you speak up against it. So let me share with you briefly some of the things I've experienced and have to do as a Black person in America. One of my biggest fears is being stopped by the police, which I have been. It's also a big fear of my children being stopped by the police. I've had conversations with all of my children regarding being stopped by the police in terms of what you should do, the protocol, which is put both your hands on the steering wheel, address the police officers, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Don't make any sudden moves without telling them what you're doing, i.e. reaching for your registration. But the fear of the police and pulling me over is a real one. When I moved into different neighborhoods as a Black man, I'm fortunate to be, I guess, upper middle class. So I've traditionally lived in all white neighborhoods. But I've always made it a point to say hello and introduce myself to the neighbors in my neighborhood. And I do that because I know if something were to happen in the neighborhood and it happened to be a Black individual, I could be subject to something that I shouldn't be because I live in the neighborhood. So I've done that in every neighborhood that I've lived in. Growing up, my parents told me, and I told my children the same, that we have to work twice as hard, we have to be twice as good in everything that we do to get the same opportunities that white individuals may get because of the color of our skin. I recall last year, I was at a fundraising event in New York City with some alumni and fundraisers, and I'm standing at the main entrance waiting for one of my staff members to come. I have to say I was looking rather dapper. I had a nice suit on, shirt and tie, and I was standing there with another staff member, and this white male came up to me and said, "Can you tell me where I put the bags or where I register?" I ignored it. I didn't say anything. My staff member was more upset than I was. And I wasn't upset because it was commonplace or things that I experience on a regular basis. So the idea of being upset would just put me in a different place as far as how I live my life. I can tell you now, if that same thing occurs, I will ask the individual, why are you asking me where the bags go, so we can have some conversation. I also recall being in high school and talking to the counselor about career objectives for you as an individual or me. What are your goals? And I told her that I wanted to be involved with sports in some capacity. I wasn't sure, teaching, athletics, or administrator. And her response was, well, the best you can hope for is to be a mechanic. And while I'm not being disparaging in terms of being a mechanic, but I discovered after that was sort of the MO for this counselor whenever she talked to Black students about their career. So those are just a few things. I could tell you a lot more, and particularly since I was born in Selma, Alabama, and I was, I don't want to show my age, but I will. So I've experienced the overt racism, whether it's going to the back of the restaurant or sitting in the back of the bus or having a water fountain that says colored only. So I've experienced the overt. Now we're really dealing with covert racism. So those are some of the reflections I went through after watching George Floyd being murdered. And I said, okay, I'm going to speak up because it needs to be done. And then my next thought was, well, what's my real sphere of influence? I'm going to speak up, but what can I do? Recognizing being an athletic director at a top university in the country, one of the top universities in the country, in the world for that matter, I realized that I had a pretty large platform working within the athletic department and then working from a regional and national perspective, which I've taken advantage of. But here's what I'd like all of you to do, because when I thought about my sphere of influence, I initially focused on athletics and my role as an AD. But when I really thought about it more and more, we all have significant spheres of influence, whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, whether it's people in the community, whether it's organizations like Rotary, whether it's the workplace. Each of us are engaged with a lot of individuals. And I want you to think about that sphere of influence and how you might use that to address racism in our society. I was going to share with you, and I guess I'll do it briefly, some of the things that we're doing at UC San Diego, especially in the athletic department. So we formed a committee that focuses on equity, diversity, and inclusion for our entire department. And they come up with different activities or books or workshops or training that we can do to help us address racism and social injustice. So all of our staff were required to go through implicit bias training. That's something else I would recommend that each of you do. We're doing it through our HR department, but you can just Google implicit bias and do some training on your own. And it just really helps all of us to understand the unconscious biases, prejudices, or stereotypes that we all have. So that's something else that we required. Our staff went through a 21-day challenge of looking at different articles and little workshops that we can do for 21 days just to educate ourselves a lot more on racism and the things that we do to put us in a place where we're not treating all individuals as equals. I also required that all of my staff read the book called Race Talk, which I highly recommend. Race Talk by Daryl Sue Wing and The Conspiracy of Silence. It's a book that talks about the difficulty of talking about it. It gives you a lot more education about the experiences from a Black perspective as well as white, but it helps to educate you a lot more and hopefully get you to a point where you feel comfortable having dialogue when it comes to race. So as I've been going through these conversations and speaking to different individuals, there's two, and there's many, but there's two major challenges that I've discovered when trying to have the conversation. One is the issue of people recognizing and accepting white privilege. That's a term that's used often. I think many white individuals find white privilege to be offensive. And really what the term really means is that because of the color of your skin, you have some opportunities that individuals like myself do not have, and you should not feel guilty about that. You should not feel apologetic about that. It's just the way it is, and that's the way it has been in our society. The next thing, which kind of ties in with the white privilege, is the issue of conversation versus confrontation. Unfortunately, when it comes to race, because it's uncomfortable, we often end up in a emotional state where it's confrontation. And I think we all agree that when you're dealing with confrontation, you're not going to get the same results if you're truly having a conversation. So I just want to illustrate to you, because the other thing I've discovered is talking to individuals that don't believe that there's systemic racism in our society. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of systemic racism in our society. I've already mentioned to you, I have this fear of being pulled over by the police. Research has shown that Blacks are 2 to 3 times more likely to be pulled over by the police. Blacks are also 6 times more likely not only to be pulled over, but to have their cars, or for them as individuals, to be searched because they're Black individuals. Did you know that if 2 applicants have the exact resume and experience, that the white individual is 2 times more likely to get an interview? I want to remind you, this is all research based. Did you know, as far as the health system, that Blacks experience racism in a lot of different ways, whether it's a Black doctor that comes into the room and everyone assumes that he must be a nurse or something less than a doctor. It's not uncommon for Blacks to receive less pain medicine because of the misconception of Blacks having high tolerance levels. Did you know that if Black children, did you know that Black children in school are often suspended for challenging behavior, suspended or expelled, and white individuals, white children that display the same challenging behaviors are not expelled or suspended? Did you know, from a car salesman perspective, that if a Black individual is buying a car versus a white individual, it's not uncommon for the salesman to sell the car to a Black individual somewhere between $700 and $800 more? So those are just a few examples to illustrate that systemic racism does exist, and I can go on a lot longer about that. I'm going to switch it a little bit because I'm a very positive individual. I'm definitely a person with a glass is half full. So I always look for the positive aspects of whatever I do. So I just want to share with you some positive things about contributions that Blacks have made, inventions to our society. One is the traffic light. That was invented by a Black man named Garrett Morgan. The mailbox that we use frequently was also invented by a Black male, Philip Downing. Did you know that the blood bank, the infamous blood bank that saved so many lives, was created by a black man, Charles Richard Drew? For those of you that iron your clothes, I'm actually one of those. I iron pretty much every day because I don't like wrinkles. So I iron. Did you know that the ironing board was invented by Sarah Boone? And the next time you go into an elevator and those automatic doors open, that was also invented by a black man, Alexander Miles. So I just wanted to share that because, as I said, I'm a positive individual. I'm going to wrap it up with a couple of things here. One is how to have the difficult conversation from my perspective. And as I've gone through this for the last several months, there's three things that jumped out to me that I believe, and I've actually used it with the town hall meeting with 300 individuals right after the George Floyd murder. I've come up with what I call my PAL rules. I'm big on acronyms. So my PAL rules are, and I think this is important to employ these before you have a conversation on race, if you're talking to someone where you think it may be uncomfortable. The P stands for no personal attacks. No personal attacks during the conversation. The A stands for assume good intent. That one can be a challenge. And I know from a personal standpoint, I've used it a lot more, and I've moved away from assuming that whatever the person said or did was in malice to assuming that it was good intent, and whether it was ignorance or whatever it is, that puts me in a different place in terms of continuing with the conversation. The L stands for be a good listener. And the reality is, for most of us, or many of us, we are not good listeners. We get triggered when we hear things, we want to interject. Our mind goes to different places when we hear things. So really focusing on listening to the conversation and what the individual is saying to you. Another thing I'm trying to employ when having a conversation about race, and that is to move from calling individuals racist, which impedes the desire for whites to have a conversation, because I believe being called a racist is somewhat paramount to be calling the N-word for a black person. So I've encouraged people to focus more on the words and not the individual. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. So if I watched Bill throw a softball and I said to Bill, "Bill, you throw like a girl." And someone said to me, "Earl, you're a sexist. You're being very sexist. You've got to be a sexist person." I'm as far away from being sexist as you possibly can be. I recognize the words that I chose were sexist, and I've made adjustments accordingly. So I think the same thing when someone makes a microaggression, macroaggression, I'm not sure if you know, but if someone says something that's offensive, if you focus on the words and not call the person a name and address the words, I think it puts you into a better place. So I'm going to end it by providing each of you what I call recommendations on things that each of us can do to really make a difference when it comes to treating all individuals as individuals in our society. The first one is using your sphere of influence, as I mentioned earlier, which is much larger than you realize. The second one is be a good listener, particularly if a Black individual is sharing his or her experiences with you. Be a good listener, fight back that desire to maybe interject or connect or say, I've had similar experiences. Don't do that. Just be a good listener, because I think you'll end up being a lot more informed by doing that. Don't laugh at racists or any other type of homophobic or whatever you want to call it, jokes, because that just perpetuates the situation. For myself, and I've experienced this, when people tell racist jokes, I'll just ask the individual, why did you tell that joke? I'm not asking for an answer. I don't expect an answer. It's more or less to make the individual a little more introspective or conscious of what they're doing. I encourage all of you to do some type of implicit bias training, and not to just go through the training, but make a concerted effort in terms of how you're going to utilize that new knowledge. I also encourage you not to say that I don't see color or I'm colorblind. That, from a Black perspective, is somewhat in line with saying you don't see me as an individual, I'm invisible. It's not a positive. We should all be able to talk about what we see and who we are, male, female, Black, white. So to say that you're colorblind, that's not a positive. This one I know is sensitive for a lot of individuals, but I'm going to share it with you. And that is, don't deflect from the real issue of racism and social injustice in our society. And when I say don't deflect, things like all lives matter, blue lives matter, focusing on the violence that might occur at a protest, and that becomes the conversation. Those are all deflections, as far as I'm concerned, from the real issues. And if you can do your part not to get involved or not to perpetuate those deflections, again, it'll put us in a much better place as a society. Last but not least, for all of us, whatever we can do to educate ourselves on racism, social injustice, homophobia, sexism, whatever we can do to educate ourselves and be open-minded, we'll find ourselves in a place that's much better than where we are today, which is a society that is more divided than it ever has been.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a real effort on each of our parts to make a difference and put us in a place, to use Martin Luther King's or one of his quotes, and that is, we get to a day where a Black man is judged by the content of his character and not the color of his skin. Hopefully I didn't go over my time, I enjoy having this conversation. It's actually very enlightening for me to have this conversation and see faces that I'm familiar with, I feel comfortable with. And you're in La Jolla. You know, I've spoken to a number of groups, and I'm glad, Bill or Cindy, you didn't bring up fining me like you guys like to do because you're in the newspaper. But I've spoken to folks in La Jolla a lot because if you don't know, you know, well, you should know. If you don't know the history of La Jolla, which is not a good one in terms of the beginning, in terms of Blacks not being able to live in La Jolla, Jews and so forth. And then my experience talking to some of my athletes and students of color, where they've made it clear that coming into La Jolla, it's often not a pleasant experience, whether it's people staring, whether it's security following them in the stores, whether it's police pulling them over. So I just wanted to share with you that I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. And I'm confident that I can count on many of you to do what you can to help us get to a better place. So that's truly the end. If you don't know Earl Edwards, and my staff laughs about this, I often say the last thing, and then I say 5 more things after. So this is truly the last thing, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I'm also really proud to be a member of this Rotary Club in La Jolla, and I will do my best to try to make myself more available as far as attendance. So thank you very much.
Whoa, yeah, I think all of us feel the same way. Earl, thank you, thank you, thank you.
I don't know if
On
there's
many
any
levels, and I'm sure everybody in this room is feeling like in this Zoom room. I'm wondering now, do you have time if people have a couple of questions to?
Yeah, I like questions, and I see a couple of people on the edge of their seats, so I can tell they're ready to ask a question. I won't identify who they are, but yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, and I'm gonna turn it over to people and not try to stop anybody, but I want to remind you, if you have a question or a comment for Earl, to unmute yourselves, because Bill muted everybody, so you have to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment.
I have a question. Earl, last time I think we saw you at the club, you brought in all the members of your men's crew after they had won the championship or something in the Bay here. And what a wonderful group of people they were. What have been the main difficulties for you as an athletic director of moving up into Division I with all the teams that you have on campus?
We've been really blessed, and I think we're an extension of how UC San Diego does business. So we've moved into the conference. Financially, we're probably one of the better funded programs, not to say we're at the Mecca point. So we've done that. I think the biggest challenge initially was dealing with the faculty. The faculty, the idea that we're moving to Division I and we're giving scholarships, the potential of lowering academic standards, which we have not done. Those were all major concerns. But I have to say that our transition, even though it's been early, out of the 11 schools, we've become one of the leaders in terms of how we operate our structure, our facilities, the outstanding leadership by the athletic director. No, I'm just kidding. But we've become a leader in the conference. So the biggest challenge for us is that we're actually on what they call reclassification. So we're not eligible for NCAA postseason play until 24. So that's the biggest challenge, although there's other postseason opportunities.
Thank you very much. Good to have you with us.
Okay.
Charles, I'm gonna jump to Charles Dick, and I only say that because when I said I could see somebody on the edge of their seat, that was Charles. So go ahead and we'll get to you right after. So Charles.
Earl, thank you very much for taking your time to share with us as you have done today. It's really thought-provoking and going to give me, and I suspect a lot of other people, food for thought going forward the balance of this day. I recently read Tom Coates' most prominent book, and I was absolutely gobsmacked when I read him say that race is a creation of racism. If we didn't have racism, we wouldn't even pay attention to race. And that, I've been haunted by this, and I'd be interested in your reactions to this. We strive, as you say, to judge a person by their character, not by the color of their skin. But how do we get to a point truly where we don't care what the color of the skin is? And I think what Coates is saying is you got to get rid of racism before you'll ever get to that point. But your reaction would be interesting.
No, I would agree with what he's saying as far as we've got to get away from racism. The only reason I'm hesitating is when I think about racism in our society, our society itself, when it comes to blacks, was founded, and I'm going to be strong in this, was founded on racism. And I say that because blacks were brought over here as slaves, right? As a result, from the beginning, blacks weren't looked at as individuals. And when we moved from slavery, our society, and this is a general statement, but I really believe in it. Our society moved away from slavery to incarceration as another way for society to continue the idea or the concept that blacks aren't part of the race. So it's an interesting question. If we were a country that was founded and blacks were brought over here to be a part of society, be a part of the wealth, be a part of the industry, be a valued member of society, we wouldn't have racism. So I just think because of all those things and not wanting to talk about it, to me, that's the biggest issue. Not wanting to talk about it or feeling uncomfortable, that I do believe that will make a significant difference moving forward. So I don't know if I answered your question, Charles. Probably not, because it's a concept I really haven't considered or delved into that. But I hear what he's saying within the book. Just hopefully that, I keep going back to this. If we can just talk about it. And again, I said it in the beginning, and I said it rather simplistically, that as a society, we've done so many things and we've solved so many issues, and none of those have been solved without starting a conversation about it. So that's the best I can do on that one. I'd like to Charles, if you wouldn't mind, send me that book. I wouldn't mind reading it. All right, thank you, Charles. And Charles, I enjoy watching you run throughout our campus.
I have a question that has nothing to do with race, but it has to do with your athletic directorship. My son started the UCSD lacrosse team in 1974. And my question to you is, and he became the father of lacrosse in San Diego and started all these and coached all these different teams. But my question is, where is lacrosse at UCSD now, nationally or in the state of California, or what is your ranking?
Yeah, so I'll be quick on this. So at UC San Diego, we have really 3 levels of sport competition. Mine is intercollegiate, which is governed by the NCAA. Lacrosse on our campus is in the next tier called club sports. So there's a club team and they compete against other universities. So we're not ranked when it comes to NCAA, but we do offer lacrosse as a club sport at UC San Diego.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Camille, I know you've got something, but you're muted. You're muted. So if you haven't, Camille, you've had your hand up for a while, but you're there. Much better.
Hello, my friend.
Yes, long time no
Bravo.
see. Thank you.
I'm going to
Thank you.
say bravo. Mwah. This is a virtual hug. What a beautiful message.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm curious, Earl, what kind of changes have you seen, or are you feeling a shift in the universe?
Yeah, no, actually, that's a great question. So I'll start it this way. One of the things that really jumped out at me watching the protests after George Floyd and others, and unfortunately watching many protests throughout my life, that the protests, the more recent protests, has been very different in terms of the composition of the crowds involved. And in fact, it's actually flipped in my mind, where traditionally you would have a large number of individuals of color being the dominant individuals in the crowd. I'm extremely, extremely pleased to see that that's really been reversed. So that to me is a major indicator that we're at a different place. I've seen on the campus and within the athletic department that there's really a focus on change and making a difference, particularly with the younger generation. One of the things I'll quickly share with you, some of this stuff, talking to the younger generation, they're naive to it. It's like, what are you talking about? That, black, white, my friends, and socially we do things, we date each other. It's not part of who we are as a younger generation, and that's not across the board, but I see a lot more. And then on our campus, we've talked a lot about doing something, but our campus, as well as athletic programs and universities across the country, have made a concerted effort to address racism. So for a good example, you'll be watching basketball teams or collegiate teams that'll have messages on their shirts or their uniforms: equality, unity, Black Lives Matters. I mean, there's a lot of messaging. So it's much, much different from the way it has been in the past, which actually for me, talking about this I feel much more comfortable in this environment versus the not so understanding or willingness to change environment. Thanks, Camilla. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Earl, I've got a question.
Sure.
Actually, I've rephrased it. First off, thank you very much for today's presentation. Two things that you touched on is focus more on the words and not the individual.
Yeah.
And one of the first words that I heard you bring up, which is perhaps new to 99% of our membership, is microaggressions.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer in stopping this slow, steady drip of microaggression, because these are the casual expressions of racial insensitivity.
Right.
A lot of the people whom I interact with, not everyone, in these moments often express apathetic indifference. And this indifference reflects either a profound ignorance of how language can be weaponized, especially when carelessness intersects with one's unacknowledged prejudice or a lack of understanding of those who occupy privileged spaces, and how they often make judgmental statements about the character of communities and individuals impacted by injustice. So by bringing up microaggressions, micro-invalidations, and micro-insults, I just want to say thank you very much, because I think for the majority of our club, the majority of our community, the majority of our state and our country, they have no clue what this means. These casual expressions of indifference are so profound. And I just want to say thank you very much. And
well, William, I'm glad you brought that up. It's something that's covered in more detail within the Race Talk book that I recommended.
Right.
And the microaggressions, and you hit it on the head. Those happen so frequently. As I said, standing at the Roosevelt high-end hotel and someone asking me about my bags, or someone stating after I finished my presentation, I really enjoyed Earl's presentation. He was so articulate. That's that's another one that people.
Did they ask why you're complaining about racism also always? That's another one, by the way.
That's another one. But the other part that helps me, and that's why I keep going back to conversation, is that I look at those things as a case of racial ignorance, racial insensitivity, and hopefully, I can respond and let the individual know, because that's what I'm going to do moving forward. Because with me not saying anything, I'm actually complicit in that bias as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm going to do that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, thank you again.
I'm happy to keep taking questions. I know you guys have a timetable.
We do, and I'm gonna say Nathan has one, and then if that's okay, and Shabnam, and then we better stop. We've already lost Bill Birch because his battery died. We're lucky that we're still up. So, but Nathan, you have something, and then Shabnam, and then we're gonna have to close down just for the day.
Sure. Earl, thanks for being here. And, I guess my question is, before this year, I didn't realize how bad racism was, and I grew up in San Diego, and I don't think we have some of the extensive problems that some of the other places in the country have. I'm just curious to see, do you think that these events are a part of the process for change, and they have to happen, and the pain has to get worse before it gets better? And how do you deal with something I had a difficult time in saying, like you mentioned George Floyd, and then earlier this year where they had, I think it was South Carolina, like the white supremacist protest. Like, I would never have expected in 2020 something like that would have ever happened or exists, and people are still like that. How do you explain that to maybe a 5-year-old Black child? And do you think that, are we doing the process right, where we have to go through this kind of pain, and are we going to come out better at the end of this, do you think?
Well, the clear hope is that we don't have to continue going through this pain. And Nathan, and I understand what you're saying about San Diego, but I want to assure you that San Diego has a lot of the national problems that we're familiar with. And I say that because I'm somewhat connected with police reform and commission and so forth in San Diego. And there's been a number of things that has occurred that if there was a camera and all, that we would be on the national stage there. So San Diego, and I know you didn't say this, but San Diego is not as kumbaya as you might think. So I just want to address that.
That's fair.
As far as children, especially young children, I think where we are now, as I was raised, Black individuals still need to prepare them for racism in our society. Hopefully when they get older, it will be different. There's actually books out there, and there's one I just read not too long ago. One of my staff members shared it with me, and it was called How to Raise a Anti-Racist Child, starting at 3 or 4 years old. So, there's ways to do that. I think we all agree one of the things that's really shameful with our society as a whole is that children, for the most part, until they get a certain age, are very much the way we would like to be throughout life, where they just see individuals as individuals, they talk about whatever, they play, there's no issues, and then they learn differently as they get older. So again, I think that's where we or you as parents, looking at your family and when kids are growing up, to do your part to instill the idea that we're all created the same and deal with it that way. So I don't know if I directly answered your question, Nathan. That was the best I could do at this time. And I will say to the group, I did share with each of you on chat my email address. So if you want to follow up, I'll just state it again, but it's ewedwards@ucsd.edu, so we can continue. And I think we have one more, right, Cindy?
Yeah, Shabnam.
Hi, Earl. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I just finished a college level class on American race relations and the legacy of British colonialism to understand the history of race in this country.
Yeah.
And every single person in my class was a white individual, except for my husband and I. But everybody in the class was there because they already understand or want to understand.
That's good.
What race is about and what racism is about.
Yeah.
And our professor was excellent. He talked about the British policies that led to the stratified American society and how the laws in this country changed after World War II. And even though the laws changed, we're still dealing with these same problems where people don't understand why there's racism in this country, right? And so what I would say is, and what you said earlier, Earl, is that it's a great idea for all of us to educate ourselves and really try to understand. And this class that I took was amazing to just understand what the history was. Why are we still doing this? And where did this come from? Yeah. So anyway, that was just a comment. But anyway, thank you so much for educating us today. And it was fabulous.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We have professors out there that are actually teaching the other side of American history, which creates a lot more understanding. But there's so much we can talk about the history and of our country when we look at the Constitution itself. Who wrote the Constitution? White wealthy men. What were their perspectives on society? Blacks were savages. Women aren't human beings. I mean, there were so many things that started us in the direction of where we are. But I'm confident that we can do better. And this is a small takeaway. This is a very small takeaway, and I'll stop right here. I've been floored watching TV at the number of interracial relationships that I see on commercials. You guys probably haven't paid attention to that, but I've been paying attention to that. And to me, it's almost, and I'm not saying that's the answer, but it certainly depicts a picture of where we're not put into these pigeonholes or boxes. I'm actually involved in a interracial marriage, and I tease my wife, and she laughs every time, that whenever I see these interracial couples on TV, I look at her and I said, "Can you believe this? What is this world coming to?"
Well, with that, I think beautifully said, Earl. Shopnob just wrapped it up in the way I would. We thank you so much for your time and your story and your perspective, all those things, and your 23 teams that you have moving around there over at UCSD, for all that you do, for all that you say, for all that you model. And we don't have a little gift that like we used to. What we're doing is we're making a donation in your name. And this year, the district's focus, as you may remember, is drug trafficking, or is human trafficking. So we're making a donation to an organization that helps with that cause called Generate Hope. And again, we thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And I know everybody was, I see a lot of, as I'm watching the screen, I just see an awful lot of positive reaction.
Well,
so we are protecting our time. We said by 1:15, we're going to get you all back, and we're 2 minutes late. So thank you everybody for coming.
And you'll see me more often, I promise.
I'm looking forward to that. Bring a couple of friends. We could certainly diversify our club a little bit and be better for it. So thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
Thank you.